Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Friday devotional, which is in Nehemiah. My passage this morning, which I'll put up on the screen now, is this one. Nehemiah 2, verses 9 to 20, which says this: When I came to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, I delivered the king's letters to them. The king, I should add, had sent along army officers and horsemen to protect me. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite officials heard of my arrival, they were very displeased that someone had come to help the people of Israel. So I arrived in Jerusalem 3 days. 3 days later, I slipped out during the night, taking only a few others with me. I had not told anyone about the plans God had put in my heart for Jerusalem. We took no pack animals with us except the donkey I was riding. After dark, I went out through the valley gate, past the jackal's well and over the dung gate, which must have been nice, to inspect the broken walls and burnt gates. Then I went to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but my donkey couldn't get through the rubble. So, though it was dark, I went up the Kidron Valley instead, inspecting the wall before I turned back and entered again at the valley gate. The city officials did not know that I had been out there or what I had been doing, for I had not yet said anything to anyone about my plans. I had not yet spoken to the Jewish leaders, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or anyone else in the administration. But now I said to them, you know very well what trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruin and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and end this disgrace. Then I told them about how the gracious hand of God had been with me and about my conversation with the king. They replied at once, yes, let's rebuild the wall. So they began the good work. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the Arab, heard of our plans, they scoffed contemptuously. What are you doing? Are you rebelling against the king? They asked. I replied, the God of heaven will help us succeed. We, his servants, will start rebuilding this wall. But you have no share, legal right, or historic claim in Jerusalem. Okay, so the rebuilding of the wall, getting Jerusalem back to the way it used to be. Now, in previous talks, people have mentioned that they quite like the historical content that sometimes feature. We had some historical content yesterday from Richard. I'm going to delve back into history a little bit here. So, 7th of September 1940, London and other major cities started to endure a daily onslaught of bombing and destruction. By 1945 and the end of the war, many of these cities lay in ruins. Many buildings and neighborhoods were flattened. What had been great centers of life and commerce were now piles of rubble. Rather like the great city portrayed in today's passage and the passages we've been reading this week, Jerusalem, long a focal point of Israelite life, had been flattened and destroyed. Now, just prior to the bombing campaign in 1940, there had been differences of opinion amongst leaders of the day, with a number of senior ministers advocating some kind of peace treaty with the then enemy Germany, a movement known as appeasement. This was seen as a way of compromising the enemy, giving ground, but to others it was seen as surrender. And the new prime minister appointed in May 1940 was having none of it. Winston Churchill's speech about fighting them on the beaches, etc., has become one of the most quoted of all time. So Jerusalem lay in ruins, but a determined band of believers sought about changing that and restoring the great city. And just as in 1940, the scheme had its detractors. And in this case, it came in the form of Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem the Arab. These influential people were determined to thwart the works. And as in 1940, strong and determined leadership was called for. A demoralized people needed to have the rebuilding vision not just spoken to them, but spoken with conviction and passion. Only then could the works be continued. The works themselves, just like those that faced Britain in 1945, were almost overwhelming. But just like the wartime Prime Minister, success in this seemingly impossible endeavour was the only outcome to be considered. And as you know, in 1945, victory was indeed achieved. The rebuilding of London was planned as early as 1942 by someone called Sir Patrick Abercrombie. I bet you've never heard of him before. But got underway in earnest in 1946. So how did we respond to today's reading? Well, let me show you first the Wall of Jerusalem. Now, this is not the original wall built by Nehemiah's time. This is one that was built much later. But as you can see, it's quite a substantial construction. So, Nehemiah had vision, he had passion, he had God's command and work in order to achieve this. So what do we learn from this? This is what I think we learn. First of all, hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. Hebrews 10 verse 23 talks about an uncompromising adherence to the vision. The vision in this case was the rebuilding. And as we can see, sheer determination and single-mindedness was called for. Number 2, do not be discouraged by detractors. There are people who will try and sow division and pick people off. There is nothing weaker than a divided and a demoralized army. Stick with the vision, however hard and improbable it may seem. Number 3, beware attacks on the leaders. Sanballat knew that he could pick off the leaders. Then he could set off a chain reaction. So the main criticism was aimed at those leading the endeavours to rebuild the city. And so it is in the church here. If our leaders can be demoralised, then the body becomes weak and ineffective. Resolve not to entertain divisive talk against our leadership. And number 4, the building vision was and still is God's. We saw that in the passage today. If God be for us, who can be against us? And this applies to the most seemingly impossible of tasks. So my appeal is that we become good and loyal foot soldiers, not yes men and yes women, but loyal. For in that way, the building of the vision will not be blown off course. Okay, a visit to Chartwell, Winston Churchill's country residence, reveals a man who was sometimes bedeviled with doubts and worries. Churchill spoke of the black dog of depression. So a more vulnerable man than the one often portrayed. I'm sure Nehemiah felt this from time to time, and maybe our own leaders feel the same way. And it is into that uncertainty that the seeds of doubt can be sown and then germinate. A seed needs water and energy to germinate and grow. We need to deprive these seeds of those things. And if they have germinated, then they need to be pulled up quickly. My appeal is, please do not undermine the work of God in our midst, but learn how these pioneering Israelites conducted themselves. And my final thought is once again from Nelson Mandela, a man who waited nearly a lifetime to see the rebuilding and the reformation of his nation. There must have been times when he was locked up on Robben Island when he despaired of anything being achieved. And then in 1991 came the turning point. And later in 1993, he became the first freely elected president of South Africa. And his thought is this: everyone can rise above their circumstances and achieve success if they are dedicated to and passionate about what they do. And that's the message I want to leave you today. Nehemiah was passionate. Let us also be passionate. So thank you again for listening.